Are transfer portal cornerbacks AJ Harris and Jalen Kimber locks to start for Penn State in 2024? I wouldn't be so sure about that.
You are Locked On Nittany Lions, your daily podcast on the Penn State Nittany Lions, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, Penn State fans? That is right, you are Locked On Nittany Lions. Thanks so much for making us your first listen and watch every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Zach Seyko, bringing you all things Penn State sports. Today's episode is brought to you by Jase Medical. Empower yourself when you purchase a Jase case, providing you with a personal supply of 5 antibiotics that treat 50-plus infections. Get yours today at jasemedical.com. That is JASE medical.com. And if you're not already, become an everyday or subscribe to Locked On Nittany Lions on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast for all of the latest Penn State analysis when it comes to football, men's basketball, now men's hockey, and wrestling very soon. That's all right here on Locked On Nittany Lions. I guess I have some explaining to do with that take of will AJ Harris and Jalen Kimber start for the Nittany Lions in 2024, because personally, I'm not so sure about that. I know what everyone's thinking. Well, then what was the point of going to get these cornerbacks? Because they can play football. They can play football. They are starting caliber cornerbacks, but I wouldn't put all of my chips in that they would start right away for Penn State in the 2024 regular season. It's just unlikely that both of them would start. And even that one of them would start, and I'll explain why. It has to do with Cam Miller. It has to do with Elliott Washington, Zion Tracy. Did we forget about those guys? And the way that Penn State's going to align defensively, they might use more safeties in 2024. But AJ Harris and Jalen Kimber, extremely talented. They're former highly touted recruits. Harris didn't get a lot of playing time, but a former 5-star, almost a consensus 5-star, but seemed to be that a national top 50 player, described as someone who's just a natural defender when it comes to coverage, just has those skills per the recruiting scouts that were following him. Good size, 6 foot, 190 pounds, but he's still raw when it comes to college football. He's only in his second year of playing. He's going into his second football system, whereas Cam Miller and some of those other players have been at Penn State for multiple years now. But AJ Harris, a very good talent with a lot of untapped potential. How long is that going to take to tap into that potential? Then there's Jalen Kimber. Now, Kimber, you might appreciate more because before this transfer portal cycle, Penn State was going into the 2024 season with only one upperclassman, and that was Cam Miller. Now Kimber becomes that next veteran, in which he might prove to be a little more important this time around. AJ Harris long-term, Kimber the short-term, but he's a veteran, started for Florida in 2023. But here's the caveat with that. Kimber kind of reminds me of Storm Duck in the sense, not from a personality, and I wouldn't even compare, this isn't an apples to apples comparison, okay? They're both talented cornerbacks, and I'm not implying that Kimber's not going to work out. But Storm Duck, as good as he was at North Carolina, kind of the same thing. That North Carolina pass defense wasn't great. Kimber's coming from a Florida pass defense that was maybe not as abysmal as the Tar Heels in 2022, but was pretty bad. One of the worst pass defenses in all of FBS. And to put it into perspective, ranked 124th in yards per attempt. So every time a quarterback dropped back to pass, Florida was allowing close to the top most yards allowed in that category. Now for Kimber, we don't know much about AJ Harris because he's only played 1 year of football. He's only been on a roster, got some tackles, but didn't really play all that much. For Kimber, we do have film. We do have the tape. He's also transferred multiple times. Funny enough, he came from Georgia as well, transferred to Florida, and now he's at Penn State. But he doesn't force a lot of turnovers. He had one interception, and that ended up being a pick six for a touchdown in 2022 with a broken hand, I might add. But he had 5 pass deflections in 2023. So he's just not forcing that many turnovers and has some decent playmaking ability when he is in coverage. But he is liable for that pass defense that Florida put together. And he was a former 4-star in high school. But the reason I'm not so sure that these two guys are starting for Penn State in 2024 right out of the gate is because Cam Miller is the true veteran on this team. He's the leader of the defensive back room to go along with those safeties, but specifically cornerback here. Cam Miller, the only upperclassman, as I have mentioned, on the team before Kimber, the only veteran on this team before Kimber joins in the cornerback spot, third year with the program. And what is the difference between Cam Miller or AJ Harris or Jalen Kimber? Because they're all former 4 stars. And Cam Miller has received high praise from James Franklin and this coaching staff. He is a former highly touted high school prospect and saw a decent amount of playing time, and he's been with the system. AJ Harris and Jalen Kimber, as far as I'm concerned, are rookies. As far as I'm concerned, they're first year players for Penn State, even though they are multi-year players in college football. And Kimber does have the starting experience. And Cam Miller is able to hold his own. Did he was there sometimes he was picked on in the Ole Miss game in the Peach Bowl? Yes, but he did make some plays throughout the 2023 season, saw a decent amount of playing time, and was definitely that next cornerback up on the boundary if Johnny Dixon or Kalen King were not available. Was he great in the bowl game? But by no means. Was he okay? Was, like I said, did he make some plays? Did he trade punches? Yes. Okay. So the difference between all of these guys is really, it's going to come down to spring practice and what they're able to do matching up and going forward. Because like Cam Miller, Zion Tracy is a highly touted defensive back recruit. So is Elliott Washington. And Elliott Washington, from what I've told and from what we've seen, is one of the fastest players on the team. I would argue that all of those guys, throw King Mack into the mix. How about Davian Collins? Did we forget about him, who transferred in a season ago? Have the upper hand because they have been with the program. They've been working with the coaches. They understand the system. Okay. So maybe we could see, we're going to see an open competition. At the bottom line, that's what this is: competition, depth. And you got some really good players to contribute to that depth because AJ Harris and Jalen Kimber aren't just role guys. They were not promised the starting spot, but they were promised that they were going to be able to compete for the starting spot because Penn State did just lose 3 starting defensive backs, veteran multi-year starters. But let's also reassess how the transfer portal has gone, specifically at cornerback. Johnny Dixon did not play right away when he transferred in from South Carolina. And I've already mentioned Storm Duck, but we saw how that went. He thought that he was going to come in, win the starting job, beat out Johnny Dixon, and that didn't happen. Transferred, went to Louisville. Anybody remember AJ Litton, Florida State, former 4-star, one of the fastest guys in the country, really never panned out at all. And Davian Collins just transferred in a season ago, and we've seen that this is a long-term type of plan. So the same case kind of applies. We cannot just assume that because AJ Harris is highly touted and Jalen Kimber, same thing, was a starting cornerback in the SEC for Florida, that does not automatically guarantee them a starting spot at Penn State. I know they lost 3 defensive backs, starting cornerbacks, but Penn State needed depth above all else. And that's the point. They picked up players who can compete. And the way that Penn State operates defensively, maybe Tom Allen might change some things, but traditionally Penn State has had that shutdown corner that ideally Joey Porter Jr., Kalen King, sometimes, they missed their assignments, but they like to have that. Then they like to have a co-starter at that second cornerback spot, whether that was Johnny Dixon and Cam Miller, or then Kalen King and Johnny Dixon shared that role in 2022 when Porter Jr. was the main guy. And then you have your slot corner. So it's been Daquan Hardy for 3 seasons, but now that role's really up for grabs. Elliott Washington, the speedster, maybe he competes at that spot. We saw King Mack in that role. Davian Collins is going to audition. But especially with the spread, those pass-heavy offenses coming from the Pac-12 now to the Big Ten, Penn State's really going to need to beef up the secondary here. And again, I go back to Penn State could just utilize more safety help. Jalen Reed and KJ Winston are very capable of man coverage, and we saw that over the course of the 2023 season. So I imagine that Tom Allen is not going to differentiate too much when it comes to pass coverage here like Manny Diaz did. So he was using Jalen Reed, KJ Winston, Zach Wheatley, all of those guys, Keaton Ellis as well, but Keaton Ellis is moving on to the NFL. All those guys were used in man-to-man coverage on obvious passing down situations. Why can't they be utilized again in the same sort of fashion when they all have now a year more of experience? And don't forget about the early enrollee freshmen. I am very high on John Mitchell, Antoine Belgrave Shorter. Those guys have the tools, the abilities to be very good cornerbacks, but they are truly in their first year of college football. So we'll give them some time. But John Mitchell, very excited to see what he can do on the football field. So don't count those guys out, and they're enrolled early. But most important part about all of this is everybody is with the team. Everybody that I have mentioned is going through spring football, and there is time to adjust and adapt. But I would not guarantee A.J. Harris and Jalen Kimber starting spots at Penn State just because we saw how it worked out with Storm Duck. It took time. It took time for Johnny Dixon, and A.J. Litton never, he didn't even see the football field, right, at Penn State. So it's not a perfect formula. Davian Collins is still going through his plan at Penn State. So A.J. Harris and Jalen Kimber are key contributors, starting caliber. But I think Cam Miller and Elliott Washington are in line to probably get that first nod for Penn State at defensive back. And King Mack as well in the slot or some form of combination. We'll see. And there will be co-starters. I think Cam Miller is probably a lock to be on the football field, but we could see Elliott Washington and Zion Tracy be co-starters. We could see A.J. Harris be a co-starter with Elliott Washington. My favorite two at this point in time from what we know are Elliott Washington and Cam Miller going into the 2024 season. That's if I had to predict somebody right now, but anything could change with spring football here. Now, coming up in the show, Penn State's had to replace all three coordinators. Crazy to think that what was supposed to be a strength in the 2023 season is now completely gone. Manny Diaz is gone. Mike Yurcich was fired. Stacy Collins is going back to Boise State. What does it all mean? Who's going to be the next special teams coordinator? As James Franklin has certainly had his work cut out for him this offseason. That's coming up next here on Locked On Nittany Lions. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, the official sports book of Locked On. The NFL regular season has wrapped up, come to a close, and the playoffs are now here. And there's still time to get in on the action with FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. And right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets, guaranteed. When you place a $5 bet, it's as easy as that. That's $150 in bonus bets, win or lose. The app is super easy to use, and there are so many different ways to bet, like live same-game parlays. Find bets in the new Explore tab. Make a parlay in the Parlay Hub, the best way to find popular parlays, so the bets are already made for you, and so much more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a layup. That is FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. And the Locked On Podcast Network is making history. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering each and every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. Never really saw this coming. Penn State had Mike Yurcich, Manny Diaz, and Stacy Collins going into the 2023 season, and now none of them are going to be back in 2024, all for different reasons. Manny Diaz takes the Duke head football coaching job. Mike Yurcich relieved of his duties, and then Stacy Collins getting a promotion, going back to the old stomping grounds out at Boise State. But you went from having all three of your main coordinators, guys who James Franklin said were the head coaches of their respective units, the offensive head coach, the defensive head coach, the special teams head coach, now all gone. It was a strength, and I agree with James Franklin. He said how important it was to have all of your coordinators back for back-to-back years so that there's familiarity, there's consistency. You don't have to change. You make some tweaks, but you don't have to relearn anything. There isn't this, icebreaker period anymore with the coordinators. But Stacy Collins, and I'll have some bigger picture stuff about offensive and defensive and all of these switches. I mean, Penn State's lost a good amount of coaches in this cycle here, but Stacy Collins goes back to Boise State. He gets probably a pay raise. He also gets a new title. I don't know that there was really much growth for him at Penn State. Could he have moved up the coaching staff? Boise State offers him that assistant head coaching role, which I imagine comes with a few more dollar signs. He also might like the area. He's spent a good amount of time coaching in the Midwest, and he's already been at Boise State. So maybe that's just what him and his family like. I would respectively wish him nothing but the best. But this does hurt Penn State's coaching staff because Mike Yurcich is not back, because Manny Diaz left. You kind of relied Stacy Collins to be that glue, be that consistency. And he was not just the special teams coordinator. He was also the outside linebackers coach. He was also the nickel cornerbacks coach too. So he was more than just the special team. Oh, he's just responsible for kickoffs. How important is he? He's also a veteran, understands defense. Stacy Collins is a smart football mind, but special teams has performed very well under his direction. Significant improvement in the kicking game overall. We saw punting not miss a beat. Jordan Stout goes on to the NFL. And then Penn State really doesn't miss that much of a beat. Sure, Stout was as good as he was, but really the punting game, kickoff, and then kick return, hit or miss, I would say. But Daquan Hardy out of the punt return game in 2023. It's like that had been missing since Jahan Dotson was at Penn State. But Stacy Collins significantly improved Penn State's special teams game, and that's going to be missed. Also, most importantly, so Penn State had the production scoring points with special teams, but I say defensively is even more important. I refer back to kickoff, right? The kickoff coverage was good, getting the football through the end zone for touchbacks, not allowing kick return and punt returns for touchdowns. Penn State was very good about that from the defensive aspect of holding points away from teams defensively. And let's not forget about Chris Stoll being named long snapper of the year when Stacy Collins, and Chris Stoll's very talented. He deserved that, but you can't help but bring up the influence that Stacy Collins had here. So experienced coach too, and just improve the team, a smart mind, and one of those remaining coordinators. But now he is gone. Replacements for Coach Collins. Well, James Franklin has always said this. He wants a head coach of the special teams because James Franklin wants to be involved everywhere in the program. He doesn't want to be overly involved in the offense, defense, one area. He doesn't want to have to babysit. So anybody that's going to take over at the special teams coordinator spot is going to have to be able to manage on their own. Franklin, again, will help, but Franklin does not want to be overly involved in one aspect. They have to be independent so that James Franklin doesn't have to contribute too much oversight. It allows coach to be anywhere and everywhere when needed. And I have a few ideas, but anybody like Stacy Collins, did we exactly know that he was going to come from Boise State to Penn State originally? No, because that was like an out of left field hire in this case, and that could happen again at the special team spot. A suggestion, one that would have made sense, but he's now at Duke because he followed Manny Diaz and built that connection. Former St. Joe's Prep head coach Gabe Infante had left Penn State. And now guess what? He's the special teams coordinator down at Duke. He's also the assistant head coach. A good promotion for him. But I have to think that had Stacy Collins accepted this job with Boise State maybe a few weeks earlier, timing is everything. Timing is everything. It's the same thing with Tom Allen becoming the defensive coordinator with Manny Diaz leaving for Duke. Imagine if Diaz made that or was hired a little bit sooner. I don't know that he made the decision late, but imagine if that process had happened earlier. Who can't help but think that Elijah Robinson is the defensive coordinator at Penn State instead of Duke? Just an idea, but timing is everything, especially in college football. Here's one that I actually really do like. I like this one a lot, and I think it could happen here. Promote Rob Smith, analyst on the staff. He was the co-defensive coordinator with Anthony Poindexter going into the Ole Miss Bowl game. Former defensive coordinator at Duke, former special teams coordinator at Rutgers, has coached football a long time. Analyst with Penn State this past season. So there's that familiarity that I've been talking about. When he was with Rutgers, that special teams unit led the nation in blocked kicks, and during his time at Rutgers, totaled 31 of them. How about that? Led the nation in blocked kicks when he was the head of the special teams unit. So I think, and Rob Smith, since he is an analyst, he would probably take this promotion. And then maybe he works with the outside linebackers and also gets that role as the cornerbacks coach too, the nickel cornerbacks coach. But Rob Smith, I think, makes a lot of sense. It's in-house. You don't have to go far. And I think he deserves a promotion. He's already been a defensive coordinator, special teams coordinator. So it's there. Calvin Lowry also comes to mind since he was an analyst working with the special teams. But I think Rob Smith, with that head coaching experience that James Franklin always talks about, is the perfect candidate to take over for Stacy Collins. But let's look big picture here. Go back to Manny Diaz taking over as the Duke head football coach. Tom Allen comes in. Mike Yurcich is fired. Andy Kotelnicki, you imagine that that's an upgrade. Kotelnicki takes over as the OC. This is going to keep happening where there's this turnover because people are probably wondering, like, James Franklin, how did you not retain any of the big three, the offensive, defensive, special teams coordinator spots? You have to find people that are loyal to Penn State. There's loyalty to James Franklin, but there's also a loyalty to Penn State and Happy Valley that needs to be had. And there are spots on the coaching staff. It's not like this is completely non-existent, folks, because you have Terry Smith. I don't anticipate Terry Smith going anywhere anytime soon. He's a Penn State person through and through. But then you have to think about, okay, I think of Brian Hartline at Ohio State, who's the offensive coordinator and is going to probably be there for a very long time unless there is some head coaching job that opens up. You never know. You never know what people are thinking. But Lowry, look, he's on the staff. Ty Howell, Dion Barnes. So James Franklin is building this, and it's going to take time. It is going to take time. So until guys like Dion Barnes eventually make their way, because Dion Barnes isn't going to be the defensive line coach forever. We know that eventually he will be due for that defensive coordinator spot, at least consideration, but we'll see how long that takes. I'm not talking about tomorrow, okay? But long-term overall, James Franklin is doing that by getting those, and Ty Howell eventually could be the official offensive coordinator. He was the co-offensive coordinator this past season, did it in the bowl game at the Peach Bowl, so that was that first experience. So think long-term. So don't be worried about it now. These were kind of short-term plans. You can't just ignore, well, Manny Diaz might not stay for 3+ years, so we're not just going to hire him. No, you take what you got, because look what happened with Penn State's defense. Was number one in the country this past season and was very, very good the year before. In 2 years, Manny Diaz really created such a foundation at Penn State for its defense. And Mike Yurcich didn't exactly work out, but he was never going to stay at Penn State for a very long time anyway. Eventually, he was going to move on. So James Franklin has a plan in place to eventually, if all things go well, Ty Howell and Dion Barnes will eventually get those promotions. Terry Smith, right? He's the second in command at Penn State. He's the right-hand man to James Franklin on that coaching staff. So you're going to see some turnover. You're going to see some change at the big coordinator spots for now. We'll see what happens with Andy Kotelnicki, right? Kotelnicki has no ties to Penn State prior to this. What does that mean in 3, 4, 5 years if everything goes well? I imagine he wants to be a head coach somewhere, someday. So what does that look like in due time? So the coordinator spots are probably going to go through some changes from here on out until further notice, but don't be worried. It's okay to be concerned in the short term. In the long term, there are some solutions. Penn State men's basketball needs some solutions as well, as the team has lost another game. Purdue, I don't want to say exactly embarrassed, because there was never really a chance for Penn State in that game. Outmatched, outclassed. We're going to talk to Zane Brancefield on the other side of this break of what Penn State men's basketball needs to do going forward, and if they have any chance of even being a consideration to get into the NCAA tournament. That's coming up next. And today's episode is also brought to you by Jase Medical. I know we come to sports to escape from some of the crazy realities of real life, but can we just talk for a minute about preparing for real life? According to the FDA, pharmacies are running out of antibiotics like amoxicillin right in the middle of the worst flu season in over a decade. This is scary. I can't imagine a more helpless feeling than if a family member or a loved one got sick while a supply chain issue kept them from life-saving medication that they needed. Thankfully, we're going to be okay because of Jase Medical. The Jase case has a pack of 5 different antibiotics to treat a long list of bacterial infections, including UTIs, respiratory infections, skin infections, among others. This stuff could happen to any of us. But you can visit jasemedical.com and complete your physician encounter. It will be reviewed by a board certified physician, and your medications will be dispensed by a licensed pharmacy at a fraction of the regular cost. It's never been more important to be prepared than today. Go to jasemedical.com and use promo code locked on to get $20 off your order. That's jasemedical.com and use offer code locked on to get $20 off your order. Remember, if you're not already, become an everydayer. Subscribe to Locked On Nittany Lions on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast to keep up with the latest analysis around Penn State sports. We welcome him back. Helped out the show a lot and grateful for his presence once again. That is Zane Brancefield. This time to talk Penn State men's basketball as well. Game didn't exactly go well as we could have guessed. I don't think anybody was going to pick Penn State to beat Purdue. Now, they did cover. They did cover. Great teams cover, Zane. We know this. 95-78 was the final against Purdue on the road. Purdue being the number one team in the country. This is a team that has lost 2 games, but to good teams. And Nebraska has really lit it up this year. But Penn State is showing us that it's just not a tournament team this year. They have too many weaknesses, and the strengths that we thought were going to be strengths, or how about this, Sam? The things that we thought necessarily, at least from my point of view, I didn't think would be a liability, have become a liability. So let's take 3-point shooting, for example. Penn State cannot get by with the way that they shoot the 3 ball. And when you already have a height disadvantage, Qudus Wahab is a good center. He's a good quality center, but not when you're going up against Zach Edey, who's 7 foot plus. I mean, you were never going to out-rebound that team. It was never going to be close. However, I mean, Penn State's still doing what it does. It forces turnovers, scores points off of those turnovers, but it still wasn't enough. So something like 3-point shooting, Zane, was supposed to be a little bit of a difference maker here, and they just continued to shoot under. Now, this time they shot 32%, but it's usually under 30% or in the 30% range, and that's just not going to cut it. So I've sold out on this team. I think they can be competitive. They'll go down to the wire with Northwestern. That's great. But if we think that this team is built to make a late run, like last year's team did with Micah Shrewsbury at the helm, and sneak into the NCAA tournament, it's just not happening.
No, I'm with you. I think this team, like, they can obviously improve. Every team gets better as the season goes on. But the most I can see this team doing is making a decent Big Ten tournament run at most. Mm-hmm. They just have a lot of weaknesses. I think the biggest one is their defense. Like, you can't count turnovers. They get a lot of turnovers, but most of those are coming from Ace Baldwin. And besides him, the team they don't stop the other team from getting baskets. They give up too many rebounds because even the other day, like, Qudus Wahab didn't have very many rebounds. He only had, I think it was 3 rebounds. And then besides that, the only other guys rebounding in that game, like recently, was Demetrius Lilly. Usually it's just Nick Kern Jr. is helping him out. Sometimes Kanye Clary, but rebounding's down. And like, they play really good gritty basketball, but it only gets you so far. And Penn State needs to figure that out. Like you mentioned, the 3-point shooting. Like, Jameel Brown finally was finding his groove again yesterday. He had 3 3-pointers. He'd been cold for the last couple of games after coming back from injury. Ace Baldwin has not been shooting the 3-ball great in his last few games. He's like hit or miss, either hits a couple or he doesn't. He was 0 for 3 against Purdue. And Penn State just needs to kind of figure that out. DeMarco Dunn was 0 for 4 against Purdue, and usually he's pretty good at making at least 1 or 2 a game. So I think it's a matter of Penn State finding their consistency. They're super inconsistent at every end of it. Like, one game, Kanye Clary will have his 18.5 of the averages. The next game, he has 5. And it's like, you can't do that. Ace Baldwin, on the other hand, too, like, he didn't break double digits in points, and sometimes he does. And then he had 13 assists, and he averages 4.9. It's like, you can't win being inconsistent in college men's basketball. It's not You're not going to win. It's not possible. And Penn State, frankly, also, they don't pass the ball enough. Like, Ace, sure, he had 13 assists. That's like the best he's had all year.
Yeah.
Nobody else is passing the ball. They do like ISO ball every time somebody comes up the court, and they just shoot these shots that they shouldn't be shooting. And they need to be having better ball movement. The offense that Micah Shrewsbury ran last year, it worked. They passed a lot. It wasn't like obviously Jalen Pickett last year played a little bit of booty ball down in the paint, but for the most part, that team was passing the ball a lot before they would take shots. And this team this year, they just like to chuck it. I know Conde Clary, like he loves to just score, but you can't win in college basketball like that. You just need to let the shots come naturally.
I just thought this Penn State team would be a little more well-rounded because they brought in Pop Johnson, Zach Hicks, a lot of players from the transfer portal, right? And you just don't have that third option. DeMarco Dunn was beginning to emerge, but it feels like he goes ice cold again, and you lose that. I like what I've seen out of Nick Kern. Kern has been really good, and what he provides defensively, because that's what Penn State needs more than anything else. In college men's basketball, let's in this case of the Purdue game, 78 points normally gets you a win, but not when you're allowing 95. I know that's Purdue, now a veteran backcourt. You still have Zach Edey, who's just a matchup nightmare. And that's Penn State's problem. Penn State, because they're so underwhelming in other aspects of the game, when there's just a matchup nightmare for them, a size, athleticism, like Michigan State. Michigan State was just able to out-athlete Penn State. In the case of Purdue, Purdue was just able to outsize them. So when Penn State has those serious mismatches, those disadvantages, they're not going to win, and that's just Big Ten basketball. Big Ten basketball is physical. There's a lot of gritty athletes, as you said, in Penn State. I think Penn State fights for Mike Rhodes. I think that Mike Rhodes is a really good coach, and I'm excited to what he's able to do with a 5-year plan in place. I know it's a 7-year contract, but you judge coaches based on 3 to 5 years, right? So I'm eager to let him have that 5 years to really settle in. But it's about building chemistry, and I think there's just a lot of Penn State hasn't found what gels, and that was similar to last year's team. But when you have a veteran guard like Jalen Pickett that's able to make those things better, Andrew Funk, Seth Lundy, Penn State just had a little more of a veteran composition to it in terms of who was actually there. So DeMarco Dunn is a veteran in college men's basketball, but he's only been at Penn State for 1 year. So that's the difference between a Jalen Pickett, because well, Zach, you're only talking about veteran experience. Penn State has a lot of veterans on this team. Kadus Wahab is a veteran. They haven't been at Penn State for multiple years. Jalen Pickett had. Seth Lundy had. Andrew Funk comes in for 1 season, and he's also one of the sharpest shooters ever when it comes to Penn State, right? And you don't have that this year. I thought that Zach Hicks could have been that, and just a little underwhelming. So Penn State's still trying to figure it all out because they do get impressive wins. It's impressive to beat an Ohio State team come back like that. It's impressive to beat a Michigan team that's still not as good this year, but still coached by Juwan Howard. I just don't know that because of how competitive the Big Ten is this year. Did they have elements of a tournament type team? Yes. But I think as we're finding out, it is really hard to gel together when you just haven't spent a lot of time together. Maybe if this whole team was together in year 2, definitely they'd be a lot better, but everybody's going to move on. You're only going to have so many players back. You're going to have Kadus Wahab move on. For example, DeMarco Dunn, Raquandis Mitchell, right? All those guys are going to move on, and then you kind of have to do a makeshift roster all over again. So this year's just kind of Mike Rhodes really establishing himself, and I hate to see it, but I look at the schedule, Zane, and when you play Ohio State again, Minnesota, Rutgers, okay, favorable matchups, but then you have Indiana, you have Northwestern again on the road, you have Michigan State again, Nebraska's proving to be a lot better. Illinois is a top 10 team at this point in time, and then you have Indiana again. So all those teams are not going to be easy. There's very few confidence building type of games, and if you drop the ones that should build your confidence, like a Minnesota, then what really happens moving forward?
Yeah, I agree with you. You definitely it's a tough schedule, really tough schedule, and Penn State definitely needs to gel. But that was expected when Mike Rhodes got this Penn State job. They knew it was going to take time. First of all, Penn State's never been an elite basketball program, so it's always been rebuilding. And so that's the idea, is that Mike Rhodes will rebuild it. I agree. I think he's a good coach. It's just going to take time. And there's only a few guys, obviously Ace Baldwin and Nick Kern Jr., they played together at VCU, but most of these guys have never played together.
And they come back next year.
Yeah, but they're the only guys that really played together. Kanye Clare was the only guy last year that really got a lot of meaningful time, and even then he only averaged like 2 points a game. So I think this team figures it out. A lot of moving pieces, like you said, losing Kudus Wahab after the season too. But you got young recruits. Mike Rhodes, I think, knows exactly what he's doing. It's gonna be slow. They'll figure it out. But if you're talking about this season right now, this Penn State team has a lot of things to figure out, and if they fix them, maybe they can make a chance. But I think there's too many pieces that are out of place for this team to really be like a top, like NCAA tournament team, and even like win the Big Ten or make a deep run. But I find it. I want to see them do well, but you have to. In this point, this team, you have to look at the little wins, them making those comeback wins like Ohio State and Michigan, covering against Purdue. I think that's a win. Like, I thought it was going to be a bigger blowout than that. So I think they have to look at the little things and just keep growing. And honestly, if they just keep developing their players, I think they'll be okay for the next couple of years.
Very well put, Zane. Thank you so much for the time. That's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Nittany Lions. You can keep up with Zane on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Zane Brancefield. You can keep up with the show as well. You can keep up with my account at Zach_Seyko. If you're not already, become an everyday or subscribe to Locked On Nittany Lions on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast. We're going to have more conversations about football, men's basketball. Now we've talked about men's hockey that just got swept against Michigan State, and wrestling, who annihilated Indiana. So all that is going to be right here on Locked On Nittany Lions.